After studying this module, you should be able to understand the basic assumptions of client-centered therapy, know about the theory of personality growth and maladjustment, analyze the three core conditions required in client-centered therapy, identify 6 sufficient and necessary conditions for therapy, and evaluate the development of this approach. The person associated with person-centered counseling is none other than Carl Rogers. It was Rogers who initiated this theory and named it as the non-directive approach to psychotherapy, in which the chief responsibility of the clinician is to facilitate people expression, clarify and gain insight into their emotions. The chief responsibility of the clinician is to facilitate people express, clarify and gain insight into their emotions. Person-centered therapy was formulated by Carl Rogers in the 1940s. He was qualified to be a clinical psychologist, and from 1928 to 40 he worked as a director of Child Study Department of the Rochester Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. While working over there, he developed his client-centered therapy. Rogers' work in the field of counseling and psychotherapy had a great impact, and it was not only because of his skills in writing, speaking and management of encounter groups, but it was also the result of various unique skills he introduced to the therapeutic field. He was the one who introduced the concept of teaching students how to counsel by observing the counseling sessions. He also came up with the ways to test therapy techniques effectiveness in controlled studies.
Periods of development of this approach. The development of person centered therapy originated with the work of Carl Rogers and his belief in human goodness. The development of this approach can be divided into 4 phases. First phase can be classified as the one in which Carl Rogers in 1942 published his first major work called Counseling and Psychotherapy. At the time, only two approaches were in the limelight, namely psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approach and behavioral approaches. Unlike the other two approaches, Rogers had a positive view towards human being and emphasized on human potential and growth. Roger felt that these two approaches lacked scientific method and gave all the responsibility to the therapist, as they assumed clinicians know best and how the session of therapy should progress. In lieu of that, he evolved his therapy known as non-directive counseling. The main goal of the clinician is to facilitate the client's process of gaining insight into their emotions to express and clarify any misconceptions and doubts they have about themselves. Rogers' theory highlighted the counselor's formation of a non judgmental and non directive climate. Rogers also confronted the validity of frequently acknowledged conventional therapeutic techniques such as advice, suggestion, direction, persuasion, teaching, diagnosis, and interpretation. Rogers believed that diagnostic tools and comprehensive interventions techniques lacked validity, and in contrast, they gave in power to the clinicians over the client, which could be misused. Non-directive counselor avoided sharing a great deal about themselves with clients and in its place concentrated primarily on reflecting and clarifying the client's verbal and non-verbal communications with the purpose of gaining insight into the feelings expressed by clients. In the second phase, Carl Roger in the year 1951 published client-centered therapy to stress the importance of client rather than on the directive method. Rogers' main focus was still on the individual's emotions. His latest book highlighted that how his thinking had undergone change on many aspects. Thus, he changed his therapeutic technique from non directive counseling to client centered therapy. He now emphasized that counseling cannot take place entirely in a non directive manner. This period focused on the phenomenological world of the client. He felt that during the course of counseling, the clinician role should be more active and significant, and he emphasized that by communicating the feelings of empathy, congruence, and acceptance, clinicians build in the environment that is conducive to facilitate people to make positive changes. Therefore, these three factors became the core components of client centered therapy, namely empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. Rogers supposed that the best way of understanding how people behave was from their own internal frame of reference. He focused more clearly on the actualizing tendency as the basic motivational force that leads to clients' change. The third phase of development of Carl Rogers counseling began in 1960s with his famous publication of the book on becoming a person in the year 1961 and continued till 1970s. In this publication, Carl Rogers mentioned about his major concept of fully functioning person and healthy individual. According to him, fully functioning individual has some characteristics which are that they are open to experience, a trust in one's experience, an internal locus of evaluation, and the willingness to be in process. In his book, Carl Roger laid emphasis on the necessary and sufficient conditions of therapy. He was interested in how people best progress in psychotherapy, and he studied the qualities of the client therapist relationship, which facilitated as an important factor leading to personality change. Throughout, Roger focused on positive growth of human beings and stressed upon innate goodness of individuals. This belief motivated Carl Roger to apply his approach to various settings beyond clinical setting. He applied his approach to the student centered teaching. He is also known as the prominent force behind the encounter groups which were used to help positive development. During the 1970s, his interest research was noticed and he made continuous efforts to identify those elements of the client clinician relationship and the therapeutic process that are most likely to bring about positive changes in an individual. The fourth phase was marked during the late 1970s and 1980s. Rogers' work broadened and he applied his techniques to various spheres of life. Hence, again, the term client centered was replaced by person centered. He replaced this term to person centered as he believed that this is best describes his concern with all humanity as it dealt with the human potential and not just client therapist relationship. Carl Rogers therapy was not just used for the treatment of individuals but also in families, organizations, groups, conflict resolution, cross cultural settings, administration, and most significantly to promote world peace. This theory came to be known as person centered approach. This alteration in term mirrored the broadening application of the approach. Areas of further application included education, healthcare, and interracial activity, international relations, politics, and more significantly, the achievement of world peace. All the way through his career, Rogers helped all individuals to feel powerful and in control of their lives at the same time boosting them to respect the rights of others to have their own feelings of power and competence. His person centered theory emerged with the belief that each individual has within themselves potential to grow fully and for self understanding, for developing their self concept and self direction. Basic assumption of client centered therapy. In the course of time, Carl Rogers' therapeutic approach has undergone lot of name change. He in the beginning called it non-directive as he believed that the therapist is not supposed to lead the client but instead should be there for the client, and at the same time the client should direct the movement of the therapy. During the course of time, while initiating the process of counseling, he realized that as non directive as he was, he still influenced his client by his very non directiveness. Thus, it can be said that clients seem to be looking towards the therapist for direction, and he would find out ways to gain some or other kind of guidance even though therapist is trying not to guide. Because of this reason, he changed the name of his therapy to client centered. Though he was of the belief that it should be the client who must be analyzing and revealing his faults and then should come up with ways of improving and also should decide the conclusion of therapy. His therapy was still specially client centered in nature, even though he recognized the importance of the therapist. Sadly, lot of therapists believe that this name of his therapy was blow for them. Thus, because of this reason, he changed the name of his approach to client centered therapy, reflecting his understanding that treatment cannot and probably should not be completely non directive. Roger now believed that clinician function is extremely active and vital, and believed that by communicating precise empathy, congruence, and acceptance, clinicians create an environment which is conducive in helping people make positive changes. In present days, the term non directive and client centered are still used. The majority of people now call it as Rogerian therapy. Later, it was Rogers who said that this therapy is supportive and non reconstructive. He cited the example of a child who is learning to ride a cycle. While the child is learning how to ride the cycle, one cannot just instruct the child, but they have to try it for themselves, and same goes for the therapy. According to Rogers, acceptance, reflection, and genuineness are key components of counseling session. He avoided intricate diagnostic and intervention techniques as he felt that it gave power to clinicians over the clients. Client centered therapy varies from other forms of therapy because client centered therapy does not focus on therapeutic techniques. What's most essential in client centered therapy is the quality of the relationship between the therapist and the client. One of the most important changes which humanistic counselors brought about in contrast to the other therapists was that they used the term clients instead of patients, as they believe that both therapist and the client are equally responsible for the progress of the client. In other words, unlike other therapies, the client is himself accountable for improving his life, not the therapist. This was a major shift in paradigm from both psychoanalysis and behavioral therapies, where the patient is diagnosed and treated by a doctor. Here, instead, the client knowingly and rationally decides for themselves what is correct or incorrect for them and what should be done about it. He emphasized that in such type of counseling, the therapist is more of a friend or counselor who listens and encourages on an equal level. Rogers alleged that even though symptoms did crop up from past experience, it was more practical for the client to focus on the present and future than on the past. Rather than just healing clients from their past, as psychodynamic therapists seek to do, Rogerian expected to facilitate their clients to achieve personal growth and ultimately to self actualize. Another reason Roger did not use the term patient because of its medical connotations and the opinion of a disproportionate relationship between the client and the therapist. He preferred the term client instead of patient as he wanted the relationship between client and therapist to be equivalent and trusting. According to Rogers, individuals are multifaceted and each person is unique. He believed that each person knows themselves better than anybody else. He felt that it was unlikely for a therapist to fully comprehend or enter the perceptual world of a client, which is dominated by the client's life experiences. Person centered approach to counseling emphasizes that the therapist induce confidence in each client. This confidence arises from the conviction that all individuals have inherent motivation to develop in positive ways and the ability to carry out growth processes. Rogers assumed that the psychologically healthy individuals have an optimistic viewpoint towards life and he continues to nurture and grow as a person. They are not anxious to take decisions and accepts the consequences of the same. He also recognized that there are psychologically maladjusted individuals whose self-concept and conditions of worth are blocked, because of which they are unable to achieve their full potential and self actualize. He assumed that the self concept was the main reason for discrepancy in people's life, and the purpose of his therapy was the reintegration of the self concept. He alleged that each individual could get stability back into their lives and solve their own problems. The main aim of Rogers' humanistic therapy is to increase a person's feeling of self worth, decrease the level of incongruence between ideal and actual self, and assist the individual to become fully functioning. The person centered approach believed in four assumptions about people, and these are as follows. First, people are basically trustworthy. Second, people innately move towards self actualization. Third, people have the inner resources to move themselves in positive direction. Fourth, people respond to their uniquely perceived world. Theory of personality growth and maladjustment. Basics of personality theory are: first, phenomenology. It refers to the individual's subjective perception, subjective environment, and his subjective experience and reality that guides one's behavior. Second, internal frame of reference. Every individual has his own personal world, and to understand the individuals, one must penetrate into his private world and try to figure out individual from his internal frame of reference. Self concept or self structure deals with the person's perception of himself on your own. It also includes the interaction one has with his environment as well as the values attached to those perceptions. The self structure is fluid and changing, but one shape serves to direct one's behavior and perception. According to Rogers, person's reaction is based on whole of their self structures and perception of themselves and their world rather than on specific portions of their perceptions as other theories might maintain. Conditions of worth. According to Rogers, children's self concepts are formed through the interaction they have with significant individuals in their lives and the signals they obtain from those people. If children experience conditions of worth and significant others are judgmental and give those messages that they are only worthwhile if they think, feel, and proceed in ways that meet up to the expectations of others, their self images and growth may be impaired. Whereas those children who receive unconditional positive regard and significant others make them realize that they are special because of who they are and not because of their importance to another or the children's particular behavior, are more expected to become actualizing and fully functioning adults. Fully functioning persons. According to Rogers, the following personality dimensions or features are characteristic of fully functioning individuals: openness to experience, living with a sense of meaning and purpose, just and congruence in self, unconditional positive regard and regard for others, internal locus of evaluation, being fully aware in the movement, living creatively. Human potential and actualization. One of the significant aspects of the human potential is people's innate tendency towards actualization, expansion, growth, and health. Rogers described that the organism has one central tendency and striving to actualize, maintain, and enhance the experiencing organism. Carl Rogers assumed that actualization occurs across the lifespan of an individual and its expression itself as a progress towards self awareness, self realization, and self regulation. According to Rogers, actualization is a universal tendency, although each person's self actualization efforts are distinctive and applicable to them. The counseling relationship. The core objective of person centered counseling revolves around the client as a person, not his problem. The role of counselor is a holistic one. He sets up and stimulates a climate in which the client is free and encouraged to discover all the characteristics of self. The counselor is responsive of client's verbal and non-verbal language and the counselor reflects back what he perceives. The client is a person in progression who is permitted to direct his own therapy. Rogers highlighted that six positions are essential and adequate for personality change to take place, which are: two persons are in psychological contact, first being the client and other being the counselor. The client, who is the first person, is in a state of incongruence, being susceptible and anxious. The other person, who is the therapist, is the one who is congruent or integrated in relationship. The therapist experiences unconditional positive regard for his client. The therapist experiences an empathetic understanding of client's internal frame of reference. The communication to the client of the therapist, empathetic understanding, and unconditional positive regard is to a minimal degree achievement. Rogers identified three core conditions which he believes to be necessary if clients are to make progress in counseling. Empathy. The term empathy designates the counselor's ability to comprehend the client at the deep level. Rogers refers to empathy as understanding the subjective world of the other and becoming thoroughly engrossed in it. By this, Roger meant that counselors should be able to perceive the internal frame of reference of another person with precision, along with attaching the emotional components and meaning to it. Rogers defined empathy as a state of being. Trox and Krakow refer to empathy as a communication skill which could be modeled and learned in a structured training program. Many of these issues associated with the concept of empathy are addressed in the empathy cycle model proposed by Barrett and Leonard in 1981. Step 1. Empathetic set by counselor. Client is dynamically expressing some characteristic of his experiencing. Counselor is keenly attending and is receptive. Step 2. Empathetic resonation. The counselor resonates to the directly or indirectly expressed traits of the client's experiencing. Step 3. Expressed empathy. The counselor expresses or communicates his felt responsiveness of the client's experiencing. Step 4. Received empathy. The client is attending to the counselor adequately to form a perception of the counselor's pressing personal perceptive. Step 5. The empathy cycle continues. The client then continues or resumes self expression in a way that provides feedback to the counselor pertaining to the precision of the empathetic reaction and the quality of the therapeutic relationship. Congruence. Second core condition which Rogers said was significant was congruence. It is also known as genuineness or realness. It is defined as the clinician's capacity to be genuine and authentic, well integrated and mindful of themselves and how they are perceived by others. Congruence is the capability to be realistic or genuine with others. Counselor congruence leads to lot of positive impacts on therapy, some of which are: it can help in the development of the progress of the constructive surge of energy in the relationship. It also assists in increasing the trust in the relationship between the therapist and his client. If the counselor is able to accept his own judgment of successibility feeling and ambiguity, then it becomes easier for the client to accept their own feelings, whether they are positive or negative in nature. If the body language of the therapist is consistent with the dialogue, gestures, and tones and are compatible with their verbal cues, then communication is clearer and more comprehensible. The counselor is able to identify the unsaid or non-verbal elements of the client in the relationship. It is based on the intended outcomes of therapy. Unconditional positive regard. Caring about, respecting, and accepting people for who they are without placing any requirements on them to act, feel, or think in certain ways to please their clinicians. Communication of warmth and positive regard is essential to helping people like themselves emphasize their positive impulses and emotions, feel powerful enough to successfully cope with their difficulties, and become more fully functioning. Prizing is an additional word which is used for unconditional positive regard, which means searching for something worth valuing or appreciating about the client. In this course of action, the client comes to value him or herself more highly. When people value themselves, they have a tendency to view others in more respectful manner. This helps the individual to unlock and reveal parts of the self which had been repressed or disowned because of early rejection. The therapist can help in throwing light on those aspects of the individuals which were in the past rejected. Thus, it can be concluded that due to this, the client begins to trust the organism valuing process.
Now let us summarize what we've learnt in this chapter. The person-centered therapy was formulated by Carl Rogers in the 1940s. Rogers called his therapeutic approach client-centered or person-centered therapy because of the focus on the person's subjective view of the world. One of the most important changes which humanistic counselors brought about, in contrast to other therapists, was that they used the term clients instead of patients, as they believed that both therapist and the client are equally responsible for the progress of the client. The main aim of Rogers' humanistic therapy is to increase a person's feelings of self-worth, decrease the level of incongruence between ideal and actual self, and assist the individual to become a fully functioning person. Carl Rogers was at all times more apprehensive about change and growth rather than of the roots of personality development, and because of this concern, his ideas about interventions came before his statements on his personality theory. He did come up with prescribed notion of personality and recommended key basics of personality theory, which were phenomenology, internal frame of reference and self, structure or self-concept, fully functioning individual, condition of worth, and human potential actualization. The core objective of person-centered counseling revolves around the client as a person and not his or her problem. Rogers identified three core notions which he believes to be necessary if clients are to make progress in counseling. These are empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. In this process of therapy, they will experience themselves. In the process of therapy, They will experience themselves in the new ways by taking responsibility for themselves and their process of self-exploration, leading to a deeper understanding of self and to positive change. Thank you.